There was once a country that stood as one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Under one flag, it controlled 15 republics, hundreds of millions of people, thousands of nuclear warheads, and one of the largest armies in history. It was the Soviet Union. Then, in December 1991, it vanished, not after a long war, not after a foreign invasion, but in a matter of days. One of history's greatest superpowers collapsed from within, and from its ruins rose Russia, a country wounded, humiliated, and struggling to survive, but never willing to accept becoming weak. Over the next 35 years, Russia would travel a dramatic road, from economic collapse to renewed power, from chaos to control, from the end of the Cold War to a new confrontation with the West. This is the story of Russia. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. He inherited a giant, but it was a giant already beginning to break. The economy was failing. Corruption was everywhere. People were losing faith in the system that had shaped their lives for generations. Gorbachev believed the Soviet Union could still be saved. He introduced two historic ideas: glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring. He wanted to reform the system. Instead, he opened the door to forces no one could control. People began speaking openly about poverty, corruption, political repression, and the failures of the Communist Party. The truth, hidden for decades, was suddenly impossible to ignore. The economy sank deeper into crisis. Store shelves became empty. Basic goods became difficult to find. And across the vast Soviet Empire, the republics began to demand something they had not had for decades: freedom. From the Baltic states to Ukraine, republic after republic declared independence. Then came August 1991. Hardline communist officials, terrified that the Soviet Union was slipping away, launched a coup against Gorbachev. They tried to take control of Moscow. They failed, but their failure destroyed what little remained of Soviet authority. During those tense days, a new figure emerged before the world: Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Federation. Standing on a tank outside the Russian parliament, he became the symbol of resistance against the coup and of a new Russia being born. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on television and announced his resignation. That night, above the Kremlin, the red Soviet flag was lowered for the final time. In its place rose Russia's white, blue, and red tricolor. The Soviet Union was gone. An empire that had shaped the 20th century for more than 70 years had become history. But for Russia, freedom did not bring peace. It brought pain. The 1990s became an era of shock therapy. Prices was suddenly freed. State companies were privatized, and millions of ordinary people saw their savings disappear almost overnight. While families struggled to buy food and pay their bills, a small group of businessmen seized control of enormous state assets. They became known as the oligarchs. Crime surged. Wages went unpaid. Life expectancy fell. For millions of Russians, the 1990s were not remembered as a time of liberation. They were remembered as a time of humiliation, poverty, and chaos. And from that chaos, a new leader was about to rise. It was the end of 1999. Boris Yeltsin's health was failing, and his public approval had fallen to historic lows. Then, in August, he made an unexpected choice. He appointed Vladimir Putin, the former head of the Federal Security Service, the FSB, as prime minister. At the time, Putin was almost unknown to the public. He had served in the KGB. He had worked as an intelligence officer in Germany. Later, he had held a position in the administration of St. Petersburg. But within a few months, everything changed. In the North Caucasus, a second war broke out in Chechnya. Putin adopted a hard, uncompromising position. His popularity began to rise rapidly. Then, on December 31, 1999, Yeltsin appeared on television and announced his resignation. "I am tired. I am leaving," he said, and he handed power to Vladimir Putin, who would serve as acting president. In March 2000, Putin won the presidential election. From that day on, a new era in Russia began. One of Putin's first priorities was to strengthen the structure of the state. He limited the power of regional governors and tightened Moscow's control over the country. He also delivered a message to the oligarchs, or, more accurately, an ultimatum: stay out of politics, and you can keep your wealth. Those who refused faced prison or were forced to leave the country. The most famous example was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the oil tycoon whose downfall sent a clear message to every powerful businessman in Russia. At the same time, global energy prices began to rise sharply. Oil and gas brought Russia the money it desperately needed. For the first time in many years, life for ordinary Russians began to improve. Salaries increased, store shelves filled, a middle class slowly began to emerge. And this stability became the foundation of Putin's power. To many Russians, he looked like the leader who had rescued the country from the disorder of the 1990s. But to his critics, he was a politician slowly suffocating democratic institutions. Independent media were restricted. The opposition grew weaker. Elections came increasingly under control. Both views were true. They were simply two sides of the same era. To understand Russia's economy, you only need to understand one word: energy. Russia holds some of the world's largest natural gas reserves. It is also one of the world's major oil producers. From 2000 to 2008, rising oil prices filled Russia's state coffers. The government paid off debts, built up foreign currency reserves, and invested heavily in infrastructure. For a country still recovering from the painful chaos of the 1990s, it felt like a new beginning. But this prosperity came with a hidden cost. Russia's economy became deeply dependent on raw materials: oil, gas, natural resources. Meanwhile, other sectors, technology, manufacturing, and innovation developed far more slowly. It was a double-edged sword. As long as energy prices remained high, Russia could appear strong. But when they fell, the country could feel the shock almost immediately. That moment came in 2008. The global financial crisis hit Russia hard. Oil prices collapsed. The ruble lost value. The feeling of stability suddenly began to fade. Then, in 2014, another blow arrived, this time for political reasons. After Russia's annexation of Crimea, Western countries imposed the first major wave of sanctions. The ruble fell again. Oil prices declined. Economic growth slowed. But Russia's government did not simply wait for the next crisis. It began building what many would later call a fortress economy. The goal was clear: reduce foreign debt, increase gold reserves, strengthen domestic production, and prepare for the possibility of even harsher sanctions in the future. That strategy would face its greatest test in 2022, after the war in Ukraine began. And later, we will return to that moment in much greater detail. To understand Russia's global power, there is one more factor we must understand: nuclear weapons. Russia possesses the world's largest nuclear arsenal. Together, Russia and the United States hold the overwhelming majority of the world's nuclear warheads. This is a legacy of the Soviet era. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a terrifying arms race, each side building thousands of nuclear weapons, each capable of destroying entire cities in minutes. When the Soviet Union collapsed, most of those weapons came under Russia's control. This included nuclear warheads that had been stationed in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. During the 1990s, those weapons were transferred to Russia in exchange for security assurances for those countries. That agreement, the Budapest Memorandum, later became the center of international debate, especially after the events of 2014 and 2022. In recent years, Russia has modernized its nuclear forces. It has developed new hypersonic missiles, new intercontinental ballistic missiles, and new strategic submarines. Putin has repeatedly reminded the world that Russia possesses nuclear weapons, especially during the war in Ukraine. Those reminders influenced the debate over how far Western countries could go in supporting Ukraine. For Russia, nuclear weapons are not only military tools, they are also political and psychological weapons. They are one of the main guarantees behind Russia's claim to remain a superpower. After the Cold War ended, many analysts hoped that Europe was entering a new era of peace. But NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, continued to expand. In 1999, 2004, and the years that followed, former Soviet bloc countries joined the alliance from Poland to the Baltic states. For Russia's leaders, this expansion was seen as a growing security threat. They argued that the West had broken informal promises made at the end of the Cold War. Western governments saw it differently. They argued that every independent nation had the right to choose its own alliances. The conflict between these two views became one of the central questions of European security for the next 20 years. In 2008, at a NATO summit, Ukraine and Georgia were told that they would eventually become members of the alliance, though no clear date was set. Only a few months later, a short war broke out between Russia and Georgia. Then came 2014. After the Yanukovych government was removed in Ukraine, Russia annexed Crimea, and conflict began in eastern Ukraine. These events were not the beginning of the larger war that came later. They were its opening pages. In the early hours of February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It became the largest military conflict Europe had seen since the Second World War. Russia's leadership called it a special military operation. It explained its position through NATO expansion, Ukraine's growing ties with the West, and what it described as Russia's security interests in the region. Ukraine and most Western governments saw it differently. They described it as an unjustified act of aggression against an independent country. In the first days, much of the world expected Kiev to fall quickly, but Ukraine's army and its people mounted a resistance few had expected. The war did not end. It expanded. Front lines formed, and names like Kharkiv, Kherson, Bakhmut, and Mariupol became known across the world. Millions of people were forced to leave their homes. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians lost their lives. From February 2022 onward, this war changed the meaning of Russia itself. Whether viewed from Moscow, Kiev, Warsaw, London, or Washington, nothing would be seen in quite the same way again. When the war began, Western countries responded with one of the most extensive packages of sanctions in modern history. The goal was clear: to isolate Russia, to weaken its economy, and to make the cost of war impossible to ignore. Russian banks were cut off from parts of the international financial system. Foreign assets were frozen. Hundreds of international companies left the country. Access to advanced technology, aircraft parts, industrial equipment, and vital components was restricted. For years, Russia had been deeply connected to Western markets. Now, much of that connection was being severed. Many analysts predicted a rapid collapse. They expected the ruble to crash beyond recovery. They expected empty shelves, mass unemployment, and an economy unable to withstand the pressure. But events unfolded differently. Russia adapted. Energy exports that had once flowed mainly toward Europe were redirected east toward China and India. New trade routes were opened. Alternative payment systems were developed. Imports increasingly arrived through third countries. And inside Russia, military production expanded at a pace not seen for decades. Factories began operating around the clock. The economy did not collapse, but it changed. It became more isolated from the West, more dependent on the state, more closely tied to Asia and to countries willing to keep trading with Moscow. And this created a question with no simple answer. Did sanctions truly isolate Russia? Or did they push Russia toward a different economic world? A world less connected to Europe and America, but more connected to China, India, the Middle East, and the global South? The final answer is still unclear. Russia has paid a price. Investment has become harder to attract. Modern technology is more difficult to obtain. Long-term growth has become more uncertain. But Russia has also shown a greater ability to adapt than many had expected. For ordinary Russians, However, these geopolitical shifts were not abstract ideas. They were felt in everyday life. Prices rose. Some familiar foreign products disappeared from store shelves. Travel became more difficult. And for many families, the future became harder to imagine. Since 2022, Russia's place in the global economy has changed completely. It is no longer simply a country trading with the world. It has become a country learning how to survive in a world that is increasingly divided. In June 2023, a series of extraordinary events captured the attention of the entire world. For years, the Wagner private military company had fought in some of the harshest areas of the war, especially around the city of Bakhmut. Its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, had become one of the most recognizable and controversial figures connected to the conflict. He was known for speaking openly. He criticized Russia's military leadership with unusual intensity. And then, in late June, that conflict moved beyond words. Prigozhin accused senior military officials of failures in the war. He announced that his forces were moving. Wagner fighters entered the southern city of Rostov-on-Don, home to an important military command center. Then, they began moving north toward Moscow. For several tense hours, no one could be certain how far the crisis would go. Across Russia, people watched and waited. The images were unlike anything the country had seen in many years. Armed columns moving along Russian roads, military positions under pressure, and a sudden sense of uncertainty in the air. For President Putin's government, it was one of the most serious internal challenges of his time in power. But the confrontation did not turn into a long civil conflict. Through negotiations, supported by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, an agreement was reached. Prigozhin ordered his forces to stop their advance. The Wagner fighters withdrew from Rostov, and the immediate crisis came to an end. Yet the event left behind difficult questions. It showed how quickly tensions inside a country can become visible during wartime. It raised questions about command, loyalty, and the relationship between the state and armed groups operating beside its regular military forces. A little more than 2 months later, in August 2023, the private jet carrying Prigozhin crashed in Russian airspace. Prigozhin and several of his close associates were killed. The crash marked the end of one of the most dramatic chapters of the war. But its meaning went beyond one man, one company, or one day of unrest. It reminded the world that Russia is a country shaped by powerful institutions, deep historical memory, and a constant demand for stability. For some, the events of June showed vulnerability. For others, the rapid end of the crisis showed the state's ability to restore control. Perhaps both were true, and that is what makes Russia so difficult to understand through simple ideas. It is a country of enormous strength and enormous pressure, a country that has endured the collapse of an empire, the chaos of the 1990s, economic shocks, sanctions, war, and confrontation with the West. Yet it continues to define its own path. Russia's future remains uncertain. The war in Ukraine continues to shape its economy, its society, and its relationship with the rest of the world. But one thing is certain: Russia is not a country that can be understood only through its conflicts. It is a nation of history, culture, sacrifice, ambition, and resilience.